God bless you, Faith Baptist Church. Pastor Zach Mays here with our sermon synopsis. So this week at Faith Baptist Church, I preached a sermon titled, A Faithful Christian Husband. And we looked at one verse. There were supporting verses, but the main verse we were dissecting is 1 Peter 3:7, immediately after Peter addresses the wife. He says, "Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to your wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered." So there were three main points. Point one is biblical submission for a Christian husband. Point two is husband, honor your wife. And point three, husband, don't hinder your spiritual progress. So point one, biblical submission for a Christian husband. The first part of the verse is, husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding. We as Christian husbands are to lead our homes and be the priest of our home and be the leader. So we are not submitted to our wives in headship, but we are submitted to how God calls us to treat our wives within our home. Now, Peter has already established for us that we are to be subjected to, as he says in 1 Peter 2:13, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme. So we've already established that within submitting ourselves to God, he then calls us to submit to different things. And the first being government in 2:17, we spoke about that. The second being in our occupation, that's chapter 2, verse 18. And then he gets into what we're in now, marital roles, which is chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. And so because we're submitted to God, we now submit to our household roles for God's glory and our good, ultimately. So he says, husbands likewise, so likewise, just as your wife submits to you, husband likewise submit to this way of leading your wife. And he goes on to say how. Dwell with them or live with them with understanding. The first order of this command, biblical submission for a Christian husband, is to live with your wife in a, quote, understanding way. With understanding, this term is a Greek term, katagnosin, which means literally according to knowledge. Live with your wife according to knowledge. Now, to get the full understanding of this text, look at what Peter says in 1 Peter 1:14 and 15. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lust as in your ignorance. So formerly, before coming to Christ, we had an ignorant way of doing marriage, of doing life, of doing household roles. We just operated the way that we thought was right. And now Peter's saying, put off that old way of understanding, that former ignorance in your life without Christ. As I said, doing marriage our way. We treated our spouse the way that felt maybe right to us. We were influenced by culture, by media, by unregenerate influencers, whoever and whatever that taught us our own way. It was a time of ignorance. He's saying, but now in Christ, now that you're born again, dwell with her, live with her in an understanding way. It could also be said this way: live with her, dwell with her in a considerate way. Why is it important to live in a considerate way? It's important because, as the text goes on to say, she is the weaker vessel. Grudem puts it this way, and I quote, "Three simultaneous understandings of the reference of the woman as the weaker vessel from the broader perspective of any kind of weakness of which husband would need to be cautioned not to take advantage. Number one, less physical strength. Number two, the difference regarding authority in marriage. And number three, greater emotional sensitivity. In that wives are often more likely to be hurt deeply by conflict within a marriage or by inconsiderate behavior." So, with this in mind and this understanding, it's my job as the Christian husband to safeguard my wife through understanding that her weaknesses are not opportunities to put her down or to keep her down, but her weaknesses are opportunities to look out for her, to cover her, to be gracious towards her, and to give loving guidance when needed. So, point one, biblical submission for a Christian husband. Conclusion: the Christian husband is committed to live with his wife in an understanding way. That is, to commit to applying biblical practices in marriage for the glory of God. This is living with his wife in a considerate way, seeing her weakness as an opportunity to honor her. Which catapults us into point two, husband, honor your wife. The next part of our text says, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel. So the considerate thing, the understanding way, is to honor the weaker vessel. And when we see this text and we see weaker vessel, it assumes that the husband too is a vessel because it's saying weaker. So it's suggesting we too, as the husbands, are vessels. We're just not the weaker vessel. And so it's a comparable function in the roles of the home. And what Peter says is it's your job as the husband to protect the weaker vessel. Now, this is language used in the New Testament. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4:7, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. And so it's just this idea that this vessel represents this body, this weaker body. Husbands, we have been tasked with the sacred duty of honoring our wives. And there are many ways we can honor our wives, but I want to give us a few. And again, because this is the synopsis, I'll give you the reference of verse, but I won't read them all for the sake of time. But we can honor our wife through providing, protecting, through purity, through purifying, and through prioritizing. So number one, we are called to honor our wife through providing. This is a physical and spiritual provision. In 1 Timothy 5:8, Paul tells us that we need to work hard and to provide for the needs of our household. Working hard is doing whatever's necessary to have physical needs met for our spouse and for our household. So the first way that we honor our wife is by providing the necessary means and income. Now, in our modern culture, it is very common that women also work and contribute to the household needs. That's okay. It's not saying that to be a true honorer of your wife should never work. It's not saying that. It just means that we are committed to doing whatever we have to do to provide for the needs of the home. The next way we honor our wife is through protecting her, keeping her safe from harm or hurt. We're kind of mimicking the relationship that the Lord has over us, right? So for instance, in 2 Thessalonians 3:3, it says, but the Lord is faithful, who will establish you and guard you from the evil one. And so we mimic God's relationship to us in a sense for the relationship between a husband and a wife. Our role is to guard her from harm, guard her from physical harm, spiritual harm, emotional harm of any kind. Obviously, if someone was coming to physically hurt our wife, we would step in and protect her and make sure that she was okay. But further than that, there are less obvious harms that we too are to protect our wife from. Maybe emotional harm, maybe some of the relationships that she has in her life, maybe even family relationships. They're emotionally not good for your spouse. So it's looking over her and safeguarding her and making sure that she maybe sees some of the blind areas that she doesn't see in her natural estate. And so it's our job to protect, to have conversations, to safeguard, to keep her from going through pain or distress that we can help her to alleviate. Another way we can honor our wife is through purity. That is keeping oneself pure as a man from other women and relationships. Okay, so Proverbs 4:24 says, "Put away from you a deceitful mouth, and put perverse lips far from you." And then in Job 31:1, he says, "I have made a covenant with my eyes that I should not look at a younger woman." And so the idea here is that men, one way we honor our wife is how we interact with other women in our life, whether that be at church or at work or wherever we find ourselves. We are called to pure relationships, and we honor our wife by safeguarding that relationship, that we might not ever talk with another woman or say things to another woman that, whether we mean it with the intent of our heart or not, that could be interpreted in a way that is flirtatious, that is not honoring towards the woman that I'm married to. And so purity in conversation, purity in the content that we watch, that we aren't putting before our eyes things that would create lustful intentions, things of that nature. So we honor our wife by walking in purity. But we also honor her by purifying her, as Ephesians 5 tells us, and talking to the husbands, that we would sanctify her and cleanse her with the washing of water of the word. So it's also our job as the husbands to honor our wife by leading her closer to Christ through purifying her, through helping her to grow in her tangible relationship with the Lord. That is our job. And lastly, we can honor her by prioritizing her. That is to nurture and mature our relationship as humans and as a couple, right? Paul tells us in Ephesians 5, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church." Christ has a deep relationship with the church because he gave everything for the church. And furthermore, Peter says in our text that we're looking at, as being heirs together of the grace of life. God has given us in our spouse a life partner, that we do life and ministry and worship and family together as heirs of the grace of life, that God has blessed us not just to live with one another, not just to tolerate one another, but to actually love one another affectionately and deeply, far above any other earthly human relationship. And so to do that, we have to cultivate intentional time together, that we might be intentional about slowing down our schedule to have a date night, or to go grab a meal or a coffee or whatever it is, and to just sit and talk together and nurture that relationship. So point 2, husband, honor your wife. Conclusion, you honor your wife through things like that. Again, this is not a comprehensive list, but some examples: providing, protecting, walking in purity, purifying, and prioritizing relationship cultivation. Honoring her is not limited to this, but the pursuit of such biblical honor will build your wife, your marriage, and by nature your life up for the glory of God and your ultimate good. And lastly, point 3, husband, don't hinder your spiritual progress. Look at what Peter says in the last part of the verse. And as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. There are different ways we can hinder our prayer life. Disobedience by sinning, praying selfishly, praying with wrong motives, whatever the case may be. Peter says here, there is one way to be sure to hinder your prayers, and by nature hinder your overall spiritual progress. That is, if we don't prioritize our marriage and the honoring of our wife in marriage. 1 Timothy 3, Paul writes to us about the qualifications for overseers in the church. And one of the most important things he says there is one who rules his own house well. And then in verse 5 it says, "For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God?" In other words, beloved church, when your home is out of order, your spiritual progress is hindered. It's of great and utmost importance to prioritize your marriage, to work on honoring your wife, to work on leading her spiritually, because in that and in that obedience is your spiritual growth. Jesus tasked us with this as a way to share the gospel. He says in Ephesians 5:32 and 33, talking about marriage, this is a great mystery. But I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So it's this reality that the greatest picture of the gospel to the world around you is a solid biblical marriage. Nothing is more important than wives biblically submitting to their husbands and husbands biblically honoring and loving their wife for the glory of God. So men, let us be committed to our home. Let us be committed to be a faithful Christian husband. By God's grace and his spirit, he will lead us and guide us to have strong Christian households. So point 3, husband, don't hinder your spiritual progress. Conclusion: the quickest way to hinder our spiritual progress is to dishonor our wife and not prioritize a pure, God-honoring marriage. Our spiritual knowledge will only get us so far, but God, by his word and spirit, will sanctify us and lead us to lead our wives for the glory of God alone. Praise